Good morning. I'm Frank Hall. I'm the Dean of the College of Science and Engineering. It was my pleasure to be introducing Sam Kean today. Sam Kean spent years collecting mercury from broken thermometers, something we learned about last night as a kid, and now he's a writer in Washington, D.C. His stories have appeared in the Best American Science and Nature Writing, The New Yorker, The Atlantic, Slate, and Psychology Today, among other places. And his work has been featured on NPR's Radiolab, Science Friday, and All Things Considered, among other shows. The Baxter Brigade was the Science Friday Book of the Year, while Caesar's Last Breath was the Guardian Science Book of the Year. The Disappearing Spoon was a runner-up for the Royal Society Book of the Year, and both the Violinist Thumb and the Dueling Neurosurgeons were nominated for Penn's Literary Science Writing Award. So without further ado, Sam Kean.
Thank you. Well, hello, everyone. Thank you all for joining me this morning. It's a great crowd. I really appreciate this. So I don't know about you, but I loved science growing up. I grew up in South Dakota, and in high school I took all the science classes I could. So all the physics, all the chemistry, biology, anatomy, everything I could. And I was totally focused on becoming a scientist. Then I went to the University of Minnesota, and again, very focused on being a scientist. I was a physics major there, and was really enjoying my classes, really set on, getting my PhD, becoming a professor, doing something professional as a scientist. But about 3 years or so into my degree, something sort of swerved on me. I started working in some labs, like doing some actual research with research scientists, and I also started doing some higher level labs in some of my classes. And I noticed pretty quickly that I wasn't enjoying the labs nearly as much as I thought as I would for a couple of reasons. First of all, I admit I was a little bit clumsy, and things like this would often happen in the labs. I would drop something, it would break. I would fry something, it would start to smoke. Things like this were not infrequent. I was just not very good sort of building, manipulating equipment. But even more than that, I realized I just wasn't enjoying being in the lab as much as a lot of the other people in my classes were. They loved sort of tinkering with the equipment, building things, troubleshooting it, and I just wasn't getting the same pleasure out of it that they were. And kind of for the first time in my life, I started thinking, well, maybe I don't want to be a scientist. And it was a bit of a scary moment for me in that I'd been so focused on being a scientist for so long that I almost didn't know who I was anymore if I wasn't going to be a scientist. And I've since found out that that's fairly common. You get to college, you think you're going to like one major, one track, you start doing it a little, and you realize, well, maybe it's not quite for me. It's okay to change your mind about something like that. So what I did is I kind of ran to the complete other end of campus, and I decided to get an English major on top of my physics major. So kind of working on both tracks there. And I liked my English major a lot. I liked reading poems, plays, novels, writing papers. I really liked digging into this great literature. But eventually I realized I missed the science. And I decided I wanted to be involved in science, even if I wasn't in the lab actually doing experiments. So eventually I realized that the best thing to do would be to sort of marry those two interests and to start writing about science, bringing science to people in a new way. Instead of sort of producing the knowledge myself, kind of talking about what it means, talking about the people behind it, kind of bringing the science to more people. And eventually, after some newspaper, magazine jobs I had, I decided that books were probably the best option for me, because I like being having a little bit of fun with the science, going into the history of it, stuff like that. So I thought this morning I would talk about each of my books for a little bit and just introduce a little bit about them. And what's kind of cool about them is that each of the books has a different topic, but each of the stories that emerged from them were a little bit unique and a little bit different. So I thought I would share some of the stories from each of the books with you this morning. So my first book came out in 2010, was called The Disappearing Spoon. And the premise of this book was to find sort of a funny or spooky or weird story about every single element on the periodic table. And I did manage to cram all 118 elements in there. Some of them just make a cameo here and there. But each element is in there. And I really had two motivations when I was writing this book. One of them was that, I don't know what your experience was in chemistry classes in high school or college. But I always got a little frustrated in that there were just huge swaths of the periodic table that we never, ever talked about. They just never, ever came up in class. And I wanted to know, well, what are the stories behind all these other elements? I wanted to give them a bit of a personality, make them come alive a little bit, talk about these obscure elements as well. But the other big motivation that I had was that I knew there were some really great stories out there about elements that everyone thinks they know really well, but that if you look a little bit into their history, they have kind of amazing backstories to them. And probably the best example of this, of an element with a hidden, unusual backstory, is the element aluminum. So I think we all probably know aluminum today, obviously. It's in pop cans and Little League baseball bats, aluminum foil. It's a bit of a throwaway element in some ways, one we probably don't think about too hard on a daily basis. But believe it or not, for a long time during the 1800s, aluminum was actually the most precious metal on Earth. It was worth far more than silver was, worth far more even than gold was. And the reason why is that even though aluminum is very common, it's the most common metal in the Earth's crust, out in nature, aluminum is usually bonded very tightly to another element, usually oxygen. So it's in a mineral form. It's not pure aluminum. And it's very hard to get the aluminum off the oxygen and to get pure samples of it. And so when scientists in the early 1800s started to get the first pure samples of aluminum, it was considered kind of a miraculous metal because it was very light, but also very strong, very attractive. It basically had everything you would want in a metal. And because it was so hard to produce and was so expensive to produce, it actually became something of a status symbol for kings and emperors to get their hands on samples of aluminum. So right here, you're looking at an aluminum centerpiece that was created for one of the emperors of France. That's actually aluminum on top, and then that's gold beneath it, because aluminum was the more impressive metal, so obviously you would want that on the top. Another French emperor also had this prized set of aluminum cutlery that he reserved for his most favored guests at banquets. And the lesser nobility were actually reduced to eating with gold knives and forks. It was considered very embarrassing to be seen eating with the gold knives and forks, and there was aluminum silverware available. And even the United States got into this game a little bit. Does anyone recognize what this is right here? Not the Chrysler Building. Not Empire State. You're on the right coast, wrong city. It is the Washington Monument in Washington, D.C. Usually you're not this close to it, but that is the Washington Monument. So in the 1880s, when the US government was putting up the Washington Monument, they decided to put at the very tippity top of it, as you can see there, a 6-inch pyramid of aluminum. And they did that for a couple of reasons. One, if you've ever been to Washington or maybe seen a picture of it, the Washington Monument is standing there all by itself, and there's nothing else around it. So they knew lightning was going to strike it at some point, and they wanted a metal at the top to conduct the electricity safely to the ground. But the reason they chose aluminum out of all the other metals they could have chosen was that the US government was kind of bragging a little bit. They were saying, we are such an up-and-coming industrial power that we can afford to put aluminum on our public monuments. Isn't that impressive? And the rest of the world was pretty impressed for a while, because not long after that, the aluminum market basically crashed completely. What happened was a couple of chemists, one American chemist and a couple of European chemists, had a breakthrough. They figured out how to mass produce aluminum on an industrial scale for the first time. And the American chemist was actually fairly young when he did this, a young man named Charles Hall. He was just 23 years old when he figured this out. He'd actually worked on aluminum production as his undergraduate research project at Oberlin College in Ohio. So he wasn't much older than a lot of people in the room today. and they called him the aluminum boy wonder. And no one probably ever made more money more quickly off the periodic table than Charles Hall did. Because he founded a company, Aluminum Company of America, known as Alcoa. When he founded this company, he was shipping out about, 50 pounds of aluminum every day. And that was plenty to meet demand. Just 20 years later, he was shipping out 90,000 pounds of aluminum every single day, and he could barely keep up with orders. He died a very, very wealthy person simply because of his knowledge of this one obscure element on the periodic table. And I like this story because it goes to show how the fortunes of the elements really do rise and fall over time. And again, how if you look a little bit deeper at a lot of these elements, they do have kind of these fascinating, unusual backstories to them. So that was a bit about my first book, The Disappearing Spoon. Then a couple of years later, I came out with a book about genetics, The Violinist Thumb. And with the genome, you get into some sort of weightier issues, things about biology, medicine, things like that. But for me, the really exciting part, I think, about genetics was the idea of unification, the idea that all known forms of life use genes and use DNA in the same way. All forms of life, whether you're talking about toads, toadstools, slime molds, dung beetles, members of Congress, whatever. Genes and DNA work the same way in all of these bizarre creatures. And I just thought that was really fascinating, that it is really the one unifying thing in all of life. But as I started writing the book, I got to notice pretty quickly that there was one thing especially that differed noticeably between the genes and the DNA of animals and other creatures, and then animals like human beings. One thing was very noticeably different, and that difference was the names of the genes, the labels that we attach to the genes. Because I don't know if you've ever read a scientific paper about genetics, or maybe a medical paper where they were talking about a different gene. But when it comes to human genes, scientists pick the worst, most awful, jargony-filled names for them. They're very long, very technical. There's random numbers and Greek letters appearing in the middle. They're very hard to even parse what they mean by this gene name. In contrast, scientists have a little bit more leeway, and they can have a little bit more fun when it comes to naming animal genes. In particular, I'm going to skip over this. In particular, I am thinking of the genes of these guys right here, the fruit fly. Now, they probably don't look particularly witty, but fruit flies have actually inspired more creative and unusual gene names than probably every other animal out there. There are different fruit fly genes named Groucho. There's one called Smurf, Lost in Space, Fear of Intimacy. There's one called Tribble, after those multiplying fuzzballs on that famous episode of Star Trek. There's one called the faint sausage gene. I have no idea what the faint sausage gene does, but it's sort of poetic, I think. There's the Tin Man gene. And when the Tin Man gene gets mutated, fruit flies cannot develop a heart. So that kind of makes sense. There's another gene that leaves fruit flies exceptionally tipsy after a tiny, tiny sip of alcohol. It's called the cheap date gene, so kind of makes sense. Probably my favorite gene name, though, was not actually found in a fruit fly. It was found in a mouse first. And that is the P.O.K. erythroid myeloid ontogenic gene. Now, at a glance, that is a perfect example of a jargony gene name where it's sort of hard to even understand what it means unless you're a specialist in the field. But if you look a little bit closer, the first three letters there are P-O-K, then there's an E, and there's an M at the beginning of the next word. It kind of spells out Pokemon. And in fact, the scientists who discovered this gene, they named it the Pokemon gene. They published a paper about it. That became the official name of this gene. However, if you look a little bit closer there, right after the word Pokemon, there's a little R with a circle around it. And that means copyright restricted. And unfortunately, the lawyers at Pokemon Inc. were not very amused about this, because it turns out that the Pokemon gene contributes to the spread of cancer in mice. And they didn't want their cute little pocket monsters, kind of understandably, being confused with tumors. So they threatened to sue the heck out of these scientists. They were really going to take them to the cleaners over this. And eventually the scientists sort of backed down, and they gave it some other terrible gene name. But for one shining moment, there was actually a Pokemon gene. Now, one question people often have with books is they want to know, where'd you come up with the title for this book? Why would you call it something like The Violinist Thumb? So I thought I would mention a little bit about why I picked that as the title for this book. So obviously, it involves a violinist, this violinist in particular, a man named Niccolo Paganini. So Paganini was considered the greatest violinist who ever lived. He was active in Europe in the very early 1800s, and every king, every emperor, every pope wanted Paganini to come play for them because he was the greatest violinist around. In fact, there are rumors sometimes, or often about blues musicians nowadays, about how someone sold their soul to Satan in order to get their talent. Well, a lot of those rumors actually started with Paganini. He was the origin of those rumors, because people said there's no way he could be this good at the violin unless he had some sort of pact with the devil or something like that. Well, there were actually some nonfiction reasons why Paganini was such a good violinist. And these reasons started with his hands. Because he had these amazingly, even sort of freakishly flexible hands. So I hope everyone can see, because one thing he could do with his hands is he could take his pinky, like this, and he could bend his pinky into a right angle with the rest of his hand just by bending it out like that. And it actually gets worse, because he could also put his hand down flat on a table, like this, flat down on a table, and he could raise his pinky and his thumb, like this, and he could actually touch his pinky and his thumb behind his hand just by reaching them up like that. So he could do things with his hands you should not be able to do with your hands. But this actually gave him a big advantage when he was playing the violin, because he could stretch his hands incredibly wide. He could do fingerings that other violinists really struggled with. It really gave him a big boost when it came to playing music. And from a modern perspective, it's almost certain he had a genetic disorder of some sort, because it wasn't just his hands that were so flexible. He could bend his elbows the wrong way, his knees bent backwards. He was basically like a circus rubber man, and there are different genetic disorders that allow your joints to be hyper-flexible like that. And I chose this as the title story for a couple of reasons. One is that we often think about something like genetics, a hard science, being on one end of a spectrum, and something like music and art, a fine art, being on another end of a spectrum, and sort of never the twain shall meet. But in this case, if you know a little bit about the genetics and a little bit about the music, you can actually see how they reinforce each other. They kind of reinforce and play into each other. And once you know something about one, it really helps your appreciation of the other and vice versa. So that's something I really strive to do in my books, is show the connections between something like genetics and art, or genetics and other subjects. And really show that science doesn't stop at the lab door. It really can help you inform and understand a lot about different aspects of the world, and vice versa. Knowing about the arts or something can help you understand science as well. It's really sort of a spectrum and a continuum of appreciation on both ends. And another reason I chose it as the title story was there is a good scientific lesson buried in here. Because Paganini did have these amazing flexible hands. But that wasn't the only reason he was such a good violinist. He was also an incredibly hard worker, practiced all the time, and he loved practicing music. He really enjoyed the practice of music. He also grew up in an environment that rewarded musical talents like that. So really it was a perfect storm of all of these things coming together. His genetics, his hands were important, but it was also his environment, his hard work, his temperament. All of those things came together. And if you talk to geneticists nowadays, that's really where the field is going. They're not talking about individual isolated genes. They're talking about things like gene-environment interactions. And we always hear about this influence on us, about this gene or that gene. And it's important to keep in mind that these are just influences on us. Genetics is a very important thing. It affects our brains, how we think, stuff like that. But there's a lot more to us than just our genetics. And if you forget about the environment and gene-environment interactions like this, then you're only going to see part of the picture. And I think Paganini really captures all of that in one nice package, because his genes were important, but there was more to it that really made him the amazing violinist that he was. So that's why I chose it as the title story. So again, that was my second book, The Violinist's Thumb. And my third book was called The Tale of the Dueling Neurosurgeons, about neuroscience, obviously. And another question people often want to know is, why'd you pick this topic for a book? Why did you choose to write about this topic in particular? And I can say with this book, what really inspired me to write it was doubt, or skepticism, mistrust, whatever you kind of want to call it. Because I had an experience where, a couple years before this book came out, I was reading something about someone who suffered a brain injury in one part of his brain, and his behavior shifted in this very unusual way afterward. And as I was reading this account, I thought to myself, that sounds like some baloney to me. I just don't believe that story is true. I think the author made a mistake here. But anyway, I sort of forgot about it. A couple weeks later, though, I was reading another account. This time it was a woman. She got injured in a different part of her brain. And again, her behavior shifted in this very strange but very specific way. And I thought, I just don't believe this. I think this is wrong. So I sort of set out to prove that these authors were wrong. Now, of course, they were right, and I was the one who ended up being wrong. So I felt a little silly. But I sort of got fascinated with these stories and looked into them a little more, and I really thought it was cool what I was discovering. So what kind of stories am I talking about here? Well, I think we can all recognize what sort of animals are in the picture here. Even if we don't recognize genus and species necessarily, we can vaguely tell what kind of animals these are. But it turns out that if you get nicked in one spot in your temporal lobe, so near your temples on the side of your brain, you get nicked in one spot in your temporal lobes, and all knowledge of animals can disappear out of your mind. So these people can tell individual faces apart. That's no problem. They can tell different plants apart. They can tell different tools apart, things like that. But dogs, raccoons, fish, elephants, whatever, they all look exactly the same to them. They cannot tell animals apart. And I started looking into this, and I realized it actually had something to do with our evolutionary history. Because if you think about our ancestors way back when, sort of wandering around the savannah, there were certain people who were very good at recognizing and classifying different types of animals, for instance. They could say, okay, these animals are dangerous, stay away, they're poisonous. These animals are good to eat, we should hunt them. These animals are good companions, we should be friends with them. And a similar thing could have happened with plants. These plants are medicine, these plants are poisonous, these are good to eat. So we are very good about classifying and recognizing different types of plants and animals. And eventually this ability to classify and recognize different types of things got sort of hardwired into our brain. And we're very good, especially with plants and animals, being able to tell them apart. It's sort of a natural ability we have. But the downside to having these sort of specialized circuits in our brain is that if they get damaged, then poof, that knowledge can sort of disappear from the brain. And that seems to be what happened with these people who suffered these injuries in one specific part of their brain. And I thought the other story I heard about the deficit was even more fascinating. So this story involved language production. And I've highlighted a part of the brain here in peach, a very famous part of the brain called Broca's area. Broca's area is involved in language production. And if Broca's area gets damaged, then people struggle to speak. They really can't get words out. Maybe we've seen some of this in like a video or a relative or something. It's a very frustrating, very sad situation. But in some people with language struggles, something a little different happens. In that, the Broca's area of their brain is actually okay. What's broken is the areas around it. So if you think about it, the Broca's area is up in your brain, but you actually speak with your mouth. So the information has to get sent from the brain to the mouth somehow. And it gets sent along what are basically biological wires, along neurons and nerve cells. So in some people, the Broca's area is okay, but the biological wires, the nerves and the nerve cells, those get damaged. So those wires essentially get cut. And the information, even though the Broca's area is okay, cannot get down to the mouth. And so these people, again, they struggle to speak. But one thing you learn about the brain as soon as you start looking into it is that there's a lot of alternative pathways for information, a lot of different ways that information can move around inside the brain. There are back alleys, detours, all sorts of different paths. And it just so happens that there's one path from the Broca's area into the emotional centers of the brain. And then the emotional centers of the brain can still get in touch with the mouth. So in these people, if you try to have a conversation with them, because the direct connection is broken, they struggle. They can't get words out. They struggle to speak. But because of that indirect connection through the emotional centers, if you start to rile these people up, if you provoke them, if you get them angry, it turns out these people can swear no problem at all. They'll say, you beepity beep beep, and then they'll sort of jump back. They're startled because they didn't realize they could speak any words, much less these words of all words. But it's a consequence of having that back alley in the brain. And there's actually something similar that can happen with the musical centers of the brain, because there's a back alley that goes from the Broca's area to the music centers, and that can get in touch with the mouth through a different pathway. So these people, even though they can't speak in a normal everyday conversation, they can actually sing song lyrics no problem at all. So there was a few years ago now, a congresswoman from Arizona, Gabrielle Giffords, got shot in the head while she was speaking during a rally. And she was one of these people who couldn't speak, but she could sing song lyrics. So she went to rehab, and they found out she could sing songs like Girls Just Want to Have Fun. And I don't know why Cyndi Lauper was sort of one song that she was able to sing, but by practicing singing, she was actually able to relearn some ability to speak. So learning about these alternative pathways actually kind of opened her up to rehabilitation and allowed her to regain some ability to speak. So again, these stories of injuries, I thought they were really fascinating because they teach you how the brain works, just based on different deficits. And this part gets injured, people suddenly start lying all the time. Another part gets injured, people can't recognize faces anymore. People lose the ability to speak, but they can still sing. So based on these stories of people with these unusual deficits, you can learn a lot about how the brain works. And that's the premise of the book, is to talk about how the brain works based on all these really amazing case stories of people who, through no fault of their own, became sort of these amazing medical stories about their deficits and eventually how they recovered from their deficits. So it's really a collection of how the brain works based on these different stories. And in addition to sort of like basic things like how we speak, how we recognize objects, toward the end of the book, it gets into a little more highfalutin territory. We talk about things like consciousness, sense of self, stuff like that. And I thought I would share one quick story about this sort of sense of self and consciousness sort of things that you can get into by studying some unusual brains. So this story gets started outside, outside Vancouver in about the year 2005. So a young woman there found out that she was pregnant, found out she was going to have twins, so she was excited about that. But at one of her sonograms, the doctor said, "I'm sorry, I have some bad news. It turns out that your twins are conjoined." So they had grown together in the womb, what used to be called Siamese twins. And so when the woman had them, as you can see in the picture here, the twins were conjoined at the head. So they basically had a Siamese brain that was joined together. And I should emphasize that the two girls, Krista and Tatiana, they are both alive today. They're healthy, they're happy, they go to school, they have friends. So things turned out okay for them. But because they have this unusual Siamese brain, they do exhibit some behavior that scientists have never really seen before. So specifically, the part of their brain that is connected is a part called the thalamus. So the thalamus is kind of a relay center in our brain for sensory information. So when you taste something, you see something, you hear something, that information goes to the thalamus first. And then it takes that information and starts sending it to other parts of the brain for more processing. So basically, it's a relay center for sensory information. So because these two girls share a thalamus, they basically share a lot of sensory information. Well, okay, so what does that mean? Well, it turns out that if one of the girls, say, takes a sip on a cup of juice, her sister can actually taste the juice in her mouth. You tickle one of them, the other one starts to laugh. One of them gets a shot at the doctor's office, the other one grabs her arm in pain. They fall asleep together. They maybe even dream together. And again, scientists have never seen anything like this, where some people were basically sharing thoughts, and on some level sharing a consciousness even. And it kind of brings up some questions about, is it two individual people, or are they sort of conjoined? Are they kind of one person kind of spread out over two different bodies? And maybe there's not a hard and fast answer in this case. Maybe it's somewhere in between. But I think a lot of the evidence points to them being individual people for a few reasons. One thing is that the girls, they often go up to someone, and one of them will say something like, "I am just me." And then her sister will say, "I am just me" as well. And that's kind of an unusual thing to say. Like, probably no one here would think to go up to somebody and say that. But, apparently they feel that they are individual people. And I think that feeling, that subjective feeling, should count for something. They feel like they're individual people. Another sort of anecdotal reason to think they're individuals is that one of the girls, one of the sisters, she happens to like ketchup. She loves ketchup on her hot dogs, on fries, whatever it is. Unfortunately, her sister hates ketchup and is always sort of scraping her tongue because she can taste it whenever her sister eats it. And it's kind of an amusing anecdote, but I think there is a good lesson in there because it shows that they're getting identical input. They're tasting the ketchup in the same way, but they're responding to it in different ways. So same input, but they're responding like individuals would. And in some, I think a lot of the evidence shows that even though they share parts of the brain and parts of consciousness, they are individual people. And a lot of these issues about like consciousness, sense of self and stuff, these are things that philosophers have been debating for thousands of years, sometimes without making getting a lot of traction and really getting anywhere about these debates. But something like these girls, and studying how their brain works, maybe we can get at a little bit of an answer for the first time. So these case studies, they helped us out in the past understand how the brain works. But they're helping us do things in the here and now and understand how the brain works in the future as well. And so I'm going to skip over one of my books, but I thought I would wrap up with a little bit about my latest book, a book called The Bastard Brigade. So this book differed from my other books in that the other books were sort of like a collection of short stories. Each chapter had kind of its own little theme or story, and they were independent. Each chapter was a bit independent. This book was a bit more of a novel in that I was following a few characters throughout, talking about their story over a long period of time. So basically, this book takes place during World War II. And we kind of all know how World War II ended, with the scorched remains of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But I don't think a lot of people realize how easily things might have gone the other way. How it could have been not an American bomb on a Japanese city, but a German bomb going after, say, London or Paris, or possibly even New York. Because at the start of World War II, Nazi Germany actually had all of the advantages when it came to building an atomic bomb. Nuclear fission had been discovered in Nazi Germany, first of all. They founded their Manhattan Project a full 2 years before the Allies founded theirs, so they had a big head start. They had brilliant scientists working on their atomic bomb project, like Werner Heisenberg, famous scientist, other Nobel Prize winners as well. And they had the best industry in the world as well, which is very important for making an atomic bomb. So all the science pointed that they would have a big head start, and there were a bunch of scientists on our Manhattan Project to build the bomb who were terrified that with this head start, Germany was going to build a bomb, hand it to Adolf Hitler, and he was going to destroy the world with it. And they were terrified of this. And so what these scientists decided to do was they convinced the head of the Manhattan Project to put together this team of scientific commandos and send them undercover into Europe with some military people to try to spy on and sabotage, and in some cases even assassinate members of the Nazi atomic bomb project. So the book covers their stories and what they were doing to try to stop the Nazis from getting the atomic bomb. And what really excited me about these, about this book were the characters involved. Really, the people are the ones who drive this story. So some of these characters include Madame Curie, although probably not the Madame Curie you're thinking of. Not the famous Marie Curie, but her daughter, who you can see here working next to her, Irene Joliot-Curie, who played a really important role in the atomic science that was going on in this era and has always kind of lived in her mother's shadow. But she really was a key player, and she really did a lot of interesting and brave things for the French resistance during the war. So she's one of the big characters there. Another one, kind of the military head of this, was a guy named Boris Pash. He grew up in Russia, fought in the Russian Revolution, came over to the US. And he was interesting because he started life as a high school science teacher. And he actually taught at Hollywood High in California. Had Judy Garland and Lana Turner, Mickey Rourke running around his school. But eventually they got him out of there, put him on the Manhattan Project, and sent him over to Europe to try to sort of capture different Nazi scientists working on the atomic bomb. Another character was John Kennedy. You can see the President John Kennedy there when he was young and in the Navy. And next to him is his older brother, Joseph Kennedy Jr. And Joseph Kennedy actually died on a peripheral branch of this mission to stop the Nazi atomic bomb. So he's another kind of fascinating character. But I wanted to wrap up a little bit with maybe my favorite character in the book, the guy in the middle there, a man named Moe Berg. So Moe Berg was unquestionably brilliant. He spoke something like a dozen different languages. He went to Princeton when he was 16 years old. He had a law degree from Columbia. And he went to Sorbonne in Paris, the famous university there, and studied medieval Latin there. So he was a brilliant, brilliant scholar. But he did all of this stuff, all his scholarly pursuits, sort of part-time. He could only do it during the off-season. And the reason he could only do this during the off-season was that his actual job, his day job, was that he was a Major League Baseball catcher. And so I really love this story of these two people. They seem like contradictory people, this kind of big, lumbering, unibrowed catcher and the classical Latin scholar, or the medieval Latin scholar, the one who would go over to Sorbonne and study things like that. So I really love this story of these two people being together. And actually, he went over to Japan at one point. You can see him here hanging out with Babe Ruth, Lou Gehrig. He was really, really one of the big celebrities of his day, just a fascinating character. But during the war, he got wrapped up in some very sort of dark deeds, some dark plots. In particular, he joined the OSS, which was the precursor to the CIA during World War II. And the OSS actually trained him as an assassin. And they sent him over to a lecture in Germany given by this guy, Werner Heisenberg, who was working on the Nazi atomic bomb project. And they sent him over to potentially assassinate Werner Heisenberg. And so Moe Berg showed up at this lecture with two things in his pocket. He showed up with a Beretta pistol to stand up and shoot Heisenberg if he found evidence that Germany was close to actually getting an atomic bomb. And the other thing Moe Berg had in his pocket was he had some cyanide pills. And if he shot Heisenberg and couldn't get away, his job, his duty, was to take these cyanide pills. And I have to say that on the surface of it, this is a completely nutty, crazy idea, to send a world-famous athlete over to assassinate a Nobel Prize winner. I mean, imagine sending LeBron James over or something to do something like this. This was basically the equivalent of what they were doing. But they were so terrified about Nazi Germany getting the bomb that they were willing to indulge in these really crazy ideas. And that plot with Moe Berg wasn't even the craziest one in the book. They were really doing some nutty things because they were so terrified of the idea of the Nazis getting the atomic bomb. So that's what the Bastard Brigade is about the adventures they had trying to stop these German scientists from getting the bomb and winning the war for the Allies. So that was my talk. But I have to confess that I have been tricking you a little bit this whole time, in that I've been telling you some stories, hopefully some amusing ones, some sad ones, some startling ones. But I suspect, maybe against your will, that you might have learned something here as well, in addition to being entertained, I hope. And I really think that telling stories is really a good way to get science across on some level. Because the human brain really remembers information best when it's presented in a story form, with sort of facts, dates, bare, unconnected statements like that, we're really bad about remembering that information. But if you put it in a story form, if you have heroes, villains, conflict, drama, if things are at stake, we're very, very good about remembering that information. And that's something I really strive to do in my books, is to not only get the science across, but kind of slip it in there into a story to make you have a little bit of fun while you're learning it. So I hope the talk today, and I especially hope the books, can help you walk away with a new appreciation, not only for the science itself, but for the really amazing stories that make science such a wonderful human endeavor. So again, thank you all for joining me. I appreciate it. Oh, I'm gonna...
Okay, well, we have a few more minutes left for a couple of questions, but before we start, I want to make sure that everybody knows that we do have books that will be for sale and for signing in just a few minutes here, including the newest one, The Bastard Brigade, and you can get them signed by Sam here today. I also wanted to take a minute to say thank you so much to all of the faculty members and professors who have encouraged their students to come today and perhaps also made it a class requirement. What an amazing thing to have the room so full. So thank you to one and all who are here sharing this day with us. So that's just been great. I have a question about what's next. I know you mentioned that you have a podcast coming out, and now that we've all heard you talk, we read the book and your voice is so clear in the book, but then to hear you tell the stories, and you have such an engaging storytelling quality, tell us about what's coming next with the podcast.
Okay, good, thank you. Yes, I have a podcast. I'm going to be starting it this spring, not sure when exactly yet, maybe late March or April. It's going to be called The Disappearing Spoon, but it's not limited to the topic of that book. It's sort of a general science-y podcast. It's called something like a science-y history podcast, where footnotes become the real story. So basically, what I'm doing is I'm taking stories that I love, that I really had fun with, but that I couldn't include in the book for whatever reason, or maybe included just a bit of it, but there's a lot more to the story. So it's going to be me narrating it. They're going to be about 15 or 20 minutes each, so fairly short, and just a lot of really cool, interesting stories I'm going to get into.
That's great. So it's coming out this spring, and it'll be available kind of wherever you can find podcasts.
On iTunes, Stitcher, stuff like that. Yep.
And you're available on social media, Twitter and Facebook as well, and
yes.
the website,
Yep.
so people can find out more from there also.
Yep.
That's cool. That sounds like a really exciting project. Backing up just a bit to talk, because I know we have so many different types of students and faculty in the room. We've talked a little bit about your writing process and the research involved. Mm-hmm. Can you tell me is there some strange places that your research has taken you that are maybe interesting and particularly notable?
Yeah, I've given talks around the world and things like that. With the last book, with The Bastard Brigade especially, I did get to go into a lot of kind of cool archives and things. In New Jersey, for instance, at Princeton, they have Moe Berg's archive. So there was like an old baseball glove and stuff like that from Moe Berg, old playing cards of his diaries that he would write things out. So it was really fun to be able to sort of go in and get like the actual letters and things that people were working on, stuff like that, yeah.
That's so cool. Do you have advice for particularly keeping college students in mind, for young writers who might be interested in sort of getting going with writing? Yeah. You know, any first steps, any advice that really resonated with you?
I think the most important thing, if you want to be a writer, is to actually write, like do the writing. So that means block out some time every day to sit down and actually do the work of writing. So putting words in the right order, putting sentences in the right order. It really is like playing an instrument or playing a sport, in that you have to practice. You have to do it each day. And I think there is a bit of a misconception that with writing, or with any fine art, you sort of wait for the inspiration to strike, and then you sit down and you sort of like get everything out at that point. But I think it's more accurate to say that you have to put in the time and effort to develop your skills so that when the inspiration does strike, you have the ability and the tools to be able to capture that inspiration. Because there's nothing more frustrating than being inspired and it's just not quite coming out right. So I think it is more of a thing where you just need to practice and do something on a daily basis. And this isn't the route, another bit of advice, this isn't the route that everyone needs to take or should take. One thing I was glad that I did, I worked on some newspapers and things where we had kind of daily deadlines. And it was good, I think, for me to get in the habit and the practice of just getting something out each day. I didn't have time to be all precious with it and go back and rewrite it a lot. I was getting editing on a regular basis. And so that's one thing I would encourage especially young writers to do, is to seek out editing and to seek out feedback, on a regular basis. So you're constantly getting that feedback. Because you can fill whole notebooks with stuff, but ultimately you do want to find readers. So you want to get that feedback early and often, I would say.
That's great. In music, we have a saying that the more I practice, the luckier I get,
Okay,
and it's
yeah.
a little bit along those lines. So I love that, or no, the muse doesn't strike you. You hit her over the head and drag her into the room with you,
that sounds
that
accurate,
kind of
yeah.
thing. So what is if you don't mind sharing, what's a typical work day like for you? Do you have blocks of writing time, or is it a lot of sort of business time and then writing time? What's sort of a typical day like?
For me, because the books are what I do mostly, or what I focus on. I usually take the mornings from maybe 8 to noon or noon 30 or so, and I will work on the books during that block. That is the time when I spend writing the books. And then in the afternoon, if the writing is going really well, maybe I'll just keep going with it and just keep knocking off chapters or whatever. Often, though, in the afternoon, I'll switch it up. I'll go to like a magazine story. Maybe I'll work on the podcast. Maybe there's some business stuff, emails to answer, things like that. And I like that because it gives me some flexibility in that, if things are going well, I can just keep going with it. But it's good for me, especially, I think, to step back a little bit. If you get a little frustrated, there's a part that's you're just not coming out right. It's often good to step back a little bit, take a walk or something. That distance can help you, I think, sort of see through blocks you might have. So that's been a good sort of schedule for me.
Great. One of the topics that comes up quite a bit in classes and in working with students is motivation, and battling through the hard times, the struggling times. And you seem super motivated. We were talking a little bit before about that you're not a procrastinator at all and this kind of thing. But certainly there have probably been moments where you find yourself up against some kind of wall or hurdle. And I wondered what advice you might have for students about overcoming those or battling that motivation, those issues that can come to us at times.
Yeah, fear is a good motivator. When you have a deadline, that is definitely big, good motivation. For me, it's always been about, what I sort of envisioned, like what I wanted to write and what I wanted to do. So it's been more about less looking at it sort of from the pain side and more from like the carrot side. That's what I want to do. And I will say, that's easy for someone to say, but when you get out and you're actually doing the writing on your own, you can kind of pick and choose what you want to do. So it's things I'm motivated to write about. So I think that will sort of get easier as sometimes you get classroom assignments and stuff you don't necessarily want to do. Yeah. But it gets easier when you kind of get to pick and choose your topics like that.
Right.
So.
And just kind of one last sort of question is, who inspires you? Are there particular authors or particular people that you have found as to be inspirations or touchstones, be it either in their writing or either in their professional pursuits or? Yeah,
with me, I can name some writers and some scientists. Sorry about that. On the scientific side, I have some scientists that I really love. Irene Joliot-Curie was one I really loved. Another one in the book named Samuel Goudschmidt, who I thought was fantastic. Going back a little bit in history, Ernest Rutherford was a favorite of mine. Isaac Newton. I've met a very famous scientist alive today named Edward O. Wilson, who's at Harvard. Brilliant, just a big thinker. I love his work. As far as the writers go, some of my favorite books or writers, The Making of the Atomic Bomb by Richard Rhodes, fantastic book. David Quammen's a great writer. He's up in Montana. He's a fantastic writer. Amy Stewart has written some really great books about poisonous bugs and plants. Deborah Bloom is great. And then sort of on the science fiction side, Neil Stephenson comes to mind, and Connie Willis is another great writer. She's in Colorado, actually. So.
Oh, great.
Yep.
Well, that's pretty much all the time that we have. Do you have anything that we haven't covered that you'd like to share or let us know?
Nothing in particular. If you have a question, I'll be out there signing books. But thank you for having me over here. I very much appreciate it.
Well, thank you so much to Sam, and thank you to our audience. And it's just been a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you.